So the thing I like to tell people, like when I'm trying to describe to people comics as a visual language, which they don't necessarily understand what that means, this is the example I show them. And when, like young artists will often show me their portfolios, and, they'll usually be into, superheroes fighting or, whatever they're into. I always sort of challenge them to say, like, could you just draw somebody who is sad? Not going to building over or whatever, but just somebody sad. And always, 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 every time, they'll give you this. Alright, so it'll be, these are not going to be great drawings, but just quick little things. If you ask someone to draw a sad person, you'll usually get this. This pen is really nice. Like sad face with a tear. Okay? Which is fine and works well, but it doesn't necessarily, sort of use the, comics composition and stuff as effectively as it might. So I usually, we're kind of used to thinking in close-ups because of Hollywood movies and stuff, which usually contain a lot of big, shots of movie stars' faces. But I usually tell, aspiring young cartoonists, how about something like this? Again, not great drawing. But if we pull back, let the character express the idea of sadness with his whole body rather than just his face. We've also put him a little off center here, just so that, it kind of creates a lot of negative space inside the panel, which maybe reflects the, emptiness he might be feeling, and so on. So we've added another layer here, right? We've added, this is kind of just character acting. This is acting plus a bit of composition. We can exaggerate that effect by basically, I'm just going to do the same thing, but I'm going to pull back even further so that our guy is even smaller in the frame. And it's just kind of one of those visual tricks that the smaller you make the guy in the frame, the sadder he will seem. Characters who are, like small in the frame seem kind of weak and pathetic and all that stuff. And, whereas big in the frame kind of, gives the impression of, power and sort of, filling the environment and stuff. So that's kind of just a, kind of slightly better version of this. If we want to start getting silly and stuff, we could do things like putting in rain, which adds sort of an environmental expression of sadness. There's some rain, there's some splashes, and so on. And so we can go even further still, because as in a movie, sometimes the camera will be looking up at characters or down at characters or, kind of, right sort of eye level at characters. And that really changes your perception of the characters. So let's say I take our guy here, and I'm just going to do the exact same thing we've done. But I'm going to move our sort of imaginary camera higher so that we're looking down on this guy. And it's still got all the elements that this other thing had. The camera's higher in the air, so we'll see the puddles on the ground and stuff. Okay, there we go. And so that, that uses all the elements that this uses. It uses the character's acting, it uses composition, it uses an environmental element, and now we're also throwing in a, a subjective viewpoint. And, I was talking about film directors and stuff there. In comics, we can do something that you can't do in a film, is that we can change the size and shape of the frame. So I'm sure you've talked about in class how sort of larger panels, it takes your eye longer to go across them, and, it kind of, puts a kind of flag in that panel in your brain that it's something important. So I'm just going to basically take this panel and explode the one edge out and do exactly the same thing, but just in a wider panel. So now we've really amplified that idea of the negative space. We've got room for just more emptiness, more rain, and so on. And so you could keep going with this. If it were a colored book, you could color this all in shades of blue or gray, give it a nice kind of somber, sad color palette, all that stuff. So I like to show this to people because it reflects kind of the thinking that you're doing with every panel and the amount of, the way you're trying to express ideas visually in every panel. Like we've used no text here whatsoever, which, is why it makes a really good example. But, when it comes to the idea of visual language, I like to kind of tell people that, in the same way prose authors have a variety of words they could use to express sadness, this is sort of what cartoonists have in terms of sort of a range of, ways you could express sadness. And, you could pick, the close-up isn't wrong, it's kind of lazy and obvious. But, you've got to, you can kind of pick how sad you want this guy to be and pick somewhere in the range. And so, yeah, when I show people this, you can kind of see the lights come on a little bit, particularly if it's people who, haven't thought that much, so much about comics and how they work. So I find it works well as an example. Okay, so the sad guy is a good example of how to compose, within a panel. But comics, of course, you've got to, put a bunch of images next to each other and think about how they relate to each other and so on. So the example I like to use, I actually learned this in animation during the very short time that I studied and worked in animation. But there's an example, I think it's Richard Williams, the animator, who came up with this example for animation of a guy who walks into a room. There he is, he's walking. And he picks up a piece of chalk. And he goes to a chalkboard and starts writing on the chalkboard. So pretty simple action, but just complicated enough that in animation this would take, a few seconds of animation and require a few keyframes and that kind of thing. I find this example works really well for comics because, we really just have to draw a few boxes around things, and we've got a little, short comic strip, about the same thing. So, this works fine as you see this kind of stuff as like, instructions on how to escape the airplane, and stuff like that, kind of simple instructional comics. It's fine, but it's not very sort of dramatic or interesting the way we have it. So, our guy is all, kind of the same size and everything in every panel, and we'll see him from the same view, which that in itself doesn't bother me. I think there's a lot of artists who really sort of crave variety and end up sort of spinning the camera around and changing the scene too much, and clarity is important. So I tend to think, variety itself is not a good enough reason to, move the camera or, change the viewpoint. But we can make some improvements to this, just by, like if here we kind of punch in for a close-up, not only does that add a bit of visual variety, but it also shows us what he's picking up. Maybe it's still on the ground. We get a little closer view of what he's picking up, because in this, it could be a cigarette or a pencil or, God knows what he's picking up. But, if we go in for a close-up there, we get a bit more information. So, I don't mind a bit of variety if it also helps provide a little bit of clarity. So, this version is already a little better. But this isn't a very interesting story, of course. So let's make it an interesting story. We'll take the same three actions, but we'll draw it as if we, as the storyteller, know that there's a serial killer loose in the building. And so how does that affect the way we draw that same 3-panel sequence? Well, let's start with exactly what we started with before, with the guy walking in. All right. There he is. He's walking. Then maybe we punch in for a close-up of him looking over his shoulder. Maybe he's heard that there's a serial killer loose or something, Then we go in, excuse me, to add a bit of suspense, we'll have, even like a simple action like picking up the chalk, we'll have it take 2 frames, one where he's reaching and one where he's got it. Just to kind of slow things down and, add a bit of suspense and that kind of thing, and some drama. Then we'll go to the panel of him at the chalkboard. And then we'll have like a big wide panel where we break, this has got a kind of a rhythm to it, where we're just kind of ticking along, but then we kind of break the rhythm, which kind of signals the reader that something dramatic is happening and to pay attention. And maybe we'll change the angle too, where we suddenly we're high, and this guy looks, we're looking down on this guy. He looks kind of small and vulnerable. His back is to us. There might as well be a target on the guy's back. And over here's the door he came in, whatever. And so this sudden shift in viewpoint sort of makes the reader think, hey, what's going on? Like, whose viewpoint is this? Maybe it's the killer's viewpoint. Maybe the killer is, about to lunge on this guy from above, whatever, that kind of thing. So you can see that, you could take the same guy with the chalk and just keep changing the dramatic situation, and it would completely change what goes in each panel, how the panels relate to each other, the angles you choose, the sort of rhythm of the panels you choose in terms of size and shape. To my mind, everything ends up being informed by story, which, I think, and not like making art that looks cool. There are a lot of artists in comics who make art that kind of, is visually interesting, but not very informative, not very sort of narrative, I guess. But yeah, I always like to, it's story first when I'm, composing within the panels or the arrangement of panels.